Hello, Agony Aunties. I have a question from somebody that my mother is dead, but this could be her question too. She says, this new stance of boundaries that have taken hold on social media. I'm in my 60s, and my initial thought is that boundaries prevent mending, being vulnerable, listening, and can be misused. Of course, natural, normal boundaries are needed when one is suffering abuse. My instinct tells me people can use putting up boundaries as an excuse not to hear what others think and feel. I'd love your feedback. Before we answer her really good question, and it's very much a generational question, isn't it? I think. Should we do what a definition of what you think boundaries are?
No.
Well, I'm going to.
Okay.
I don't have an answer.
So you can argue with
Well,
me.
okay.
You speak, Em.
No, go ahead. I'm not sure people need that, but okay.
Okay.
Go on.
No,
Go on.
go boundary. I think it's good to do
Define
a
it.
definition.
Really helpful. Yeah, go
Yes. You get rid of all.
on.
So
On your naysayers.
Yes.
each of us has a different sense of boundaries, of the distance that we need between us and other people, and they can be emotional and they can be physical. I mean, one of the exercises we did when I was training about boundaries was you'd have somebody opposite you and you'd walk that person would stay still and you'd walk towards them until you got to a point that you didn't want to go any further. And so for each of us on the course, how close you got was different for different people, so that we can have different boundaries with different people in different situations. And they are about touch, but they're also emotional boundaries that you can feel intruded on. If people kind of ask too many emotional questions, or it feels intrusive, as well as physical boundaries if you feel people come too close.
Yeah, and I would say to this listener that I think I know what she means. I think there is like this sort of like therapies language that can be weaponized, where you can't say anything to anybody because it's abusive or it's gaslighting or you're doing this to me. That is maybe true of the word boundaries as well. But I don't think that stops it being a useful concept. I think that like both can be true. Like any kind of concept can be misused, I suppose. But boundaries, I think, are really also about self-worth. Like this is what I will take, and this is what I will not take.
Oh, that's good.
And this is what I will do to accommodate you in the sense that we are in a relationship in whatever context. And this is what I will not do to accommodate you because it's to the detriment of myself, like too much to the detriment of myself. So it might be, there's all sorts of things that I might do as a friend or as a parent or whatever that is not totally comfortable to me, but I'm happy to do it to accommodate the other person or because relationships are about give and take. And then it gets to a point where I'm like, no, I actually can't do that because it's too much to the detriment of me or it makes me too uncomfortable. And actually, that's a very important protective thing to have in your life because it allows you to say the yes, I think, because you kind of know your own no, I guess. And then obviously boundaries within a therapeutic relationship are completely essential. Like that you couldn't have therapy without boundaries. And this podcast, weirdly, is a lot of breaking lots of therapeutic boundaries, which is something we've thought about before. And it's definitely still something that I'm like, ooh, I'm not sure. I'm obviously doing it, but I'm not totally sure what I think about it.
Yes, and in that sense, boundaries are often about safety, aren't they? Like that's why they're so important in therapy. But I was also thinking that sort of what the listener was referencing is somehow this, maybe it's happening more, or maybe it just feels like it's happening more, that people get to declare a boundary and it's non-negotiable. And while occasionally we can have a non-negotiable boundary, if you're in a relationship, hopefully you can negotiate boundaries. Like say, I might say to you, I really don't ever want to do that. But then if you're in a relationship, there is, within reason, a conversation. Okay, well, tell me about that. What does that mean? Why never? Why is that never okay? Because I have this opposing need, which is that sometimes I would really like to do that. And can we dialogue about where your boundary is and where my boundary is, and also what's driving? What's the threat? We talk about boundaries like this is a thing to keep me safe, to protect me, and to hold on to my self-worth and value. And sometimes even just being understood that we feel threatened can allow ourselves to shift the boundary, go, okay, well, now you've really understood that that means X to me. I actually don't need to drive that boundary quite so hard. So I would hope that of course, if you're in abusive relationships, if you're with someone who really is unable to dialogue around experiences and can't hear you, then sometimes you do just need to be black and white without explanation. But ideally, we would operate in a world where boundaries is a conversation, not a declaration.
Oh,
That
nice.
it's something that you talk between. And I think we can all be curious about towards ourselves when we feel that desire to set a boundary. It doesn't mean, I think boundaries are, as we've said, are incredibly important, but we can also, or someone else's boundary in terms of empathy, and be curious about our own boundaries and curious about others rather than defensive, which I think is what can lead to this putting up barriers experience rather than like, oh, it's so interesting, I have a boundary in this place. Why does it feel really threatening when someone says no to me? And or whatever, I don't know, that's a great example, but we can be curious about both our own boundaries and about when someone else has set them. One response to someone who said, don't do this is my boundary, is to be interested in that. You don't need to stomp off in the opposite direction. You can be like, okay, let me understand that.
Definitely. And there are some places where I think boundaries are essential, like I said, therapy.
Do you,
But also,
do
actually, if
you
you're
want to describe what it is in therapy about boundaries that's essential?
Well, I think boundaries vary between therapists, but there are some basic boundaries that pretty much all therapists should adhere to. Obviously, the boundary of confidentiality, for the room to feel safe, you have to know that your therapist is not going to talk to other people about what you've said. I think there is the boundaries of place, time, place and time. Like we will meet here at this time for this long, that can be very containing. I think there's the boundary, and this is the one where the podcast really pushes this boundary, and it's a much more grey area boundary of how much about myself am I going to share with you as my client, and is what I'm sharing about myself to your benefit, or is this really about something to do with me? And that's actually a boundary that gets pushed a lot working with children, because children ask you so many personal questions all the time, and they just often are like, no, but like, why can't you just answer? Like, I've asked you a question, why are you answering it with a question? Like, they don't know the rules of therapy. So then you have to like think really, really hard of like, is this a question that it's okay to answer in this context? And why is this child asking this question? What is the meaning there? And then decide what your answer is going to be.
But only that the boundary of sort of having a relationship with your therapist outside of the therapeutic one.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Big one.
So particularly, obviously, any kind of sexual relationship,
but also friendship.
But friendship, all of which can really complicate the actual therapeutic work, and dangerous at times.
I think, well, you were going to say something when I interrupted you, asking you to talk about.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think boundaries are also essential if you have young children. Young children really need boundaries. And like Sophie said, it doesn't mean that they are completely inflexible, but I think boundaries are often needed for young children to feel safe. They need to know that they're contained, essentially.
No fun.
What kind of
rules.
things?
Well, I think it's really individual, like what the boundaries are for your family, but I think they need to sort of be clear and consistent. Like, it's not okay to punch your sister in the face, might be a boundary that you want to keep to. It's not okay to like chuck your food on the floor intentionally, or like, those. I'm talking very practically, also with the knowledge that all toddlers, young children, will do those things anyway. But it doesn't mean that you can't hold a boundary and validate their feelings alongside the boundary. I guess that's the thing.
Yes, you shared that Instagram account, Big Little Feelings, with me, which I think does some very nice little short videos about that.
Big Little Feelings is very good for how you hold boundaries alongside validating feelings. It's not punitive.
And I mean, my last thing I would say is fences allow us to have good neighbours. And so there's this idea of, if I give you space and I have my own space, then it gives me internal space to be able to connect with you. But if I'm not at all clear about where our boundaries are, where the fence is, I can feel very kind of unsafe, because I think boundary can give a real clarity that can in fact be liberating rather than imprisoning.
Not a wall, a fence.
Not a wall. So on that note, Emily and Sophie, thank you. And thank you everyone to listening. And do drop us a message if you have questions for our Agony Aunties. We really enjoy receiving your questions and answering your questions. And do please rate and subscribe and share the podcast. Thank you. Bye.